I kind of try to stay away from those titles of revered and venerable and all that kind of stuff because um, I feel like it sort of sets a person aside from others. It's a kind of um, not appreciating the interdependent nature of our um, relationships in life. But Ruben asked me to talk about my spiritual journey. And so I was writing a few things about it, trying to figure out what might be interesting to others to hear about. And I guess I have to start when I was about 4 years old because my father was in the Army, the full-time Army at that time, and he wouldn't allow us to come as a family to the place where he was stationed because he didn't feel like it was a suitable place to bring a family. So my mother had to take us to church with her on Sundays because I grew up as a Catholic. Both my parents were converts, which I consider a plus because they weren't bogged down by all of the paraphernalia of the Catholic Church. And my father was actually against organized religion, which I came to kind of inherit over the years. But when I was about 4 years old, my mother took us to church with her on Sunday, and I'm a very different kind of spiritual seeker. A lot of people in this Zen tradition particularly are very introverted, but I came out of the womb as an extrovert. I don't know why, but I've always been very extroverted, and everyone says, oh, that's such a nice quality, but the problem with being an extrovert is that you can't not engage, and it's exhausting. So for me, at the age of 4, to go to church, sit next to my mother, whom I loved very much, and have her hold my hand and be in this quiet environment was a very balancing kind of experience. And I really consider that the beginning of my personal spiritual quest. And it has influenced me a lot over the years. When I got into kindergarten, I went to a Catholic school by default because it was the closest school to our house. And one day, the pastor of our parish came and told us about his life and his life as a priest. And at the end of his talk, he asked who thinks they would like to become a priest. And I was the only one in my kindergarten class that raised my hand. And of course, he and my teacher laughed and they said, oh, you can't become a priest, you have to become a nun. So I didn't know what that meant. And I said, okay, I'll become a nun. So for most of my life, well, for all of my life from then on, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an altar boy, altar girl, but they wouldn't let me because I was a girl. But I memorized the Mass in Latin and, aspired to that. But all my life, I spent a lot of time in church, even though none of my friends really knew what I was aspiring to. A couple of years ago, my friends from elementary school found me on Facebook, and we kind of reunited. And they were very surprised at what I'm doing. But the biggest surprise was that I had wanted to be a nun all my life because somehow they didn't see that. So that's I went to the convent after high school. It was at a time of great chaos in the Catholic Church. And I found it very confusing, even though I loved it. I loved the life. But it was confusing because at that time, it was in the early 60s, there was a lot of conflict about how to go forward. I always say that Pope John the 23rd, who was a very liberal pope, um, he he said, "Let's open the windows and let in some fresh air," and then he died. And so it created a lot of questions and ideas about change, but we didn't have any kind of roadmap at all. And so what I found in the convent was that there were two sides: those who wanted change and probably sought it in ways that weren't particularly the most nurturing, but those who wanted everything to stay the same. And there was a huge division. And so for a young person in their teens who was aspiring to some kind of deep spiritual life, it was very confusing. When I was 21, I left. And at that point, I just couldn't believe in anything anymore. And I threw out the baby with the bathwater and lived a pretty wild life in my 20s. And of course, by the end of my 20s, I was not wanting to do that anymore. It had just created a lot of confusion. And so I went on a search for a teacher. And what I did was I got on a bus, I got a ticket to go anywhere I wanted, and I could change it whenever I wanted. And first I went down to Colorado and visited some of my ex-nun friends who had, left after me, but whom I still kept in touch with. Then I went out to San Diego to visit my sister, who was living there with her boyfriend. And I ended up in San Francisco. I had this ticket to go wherever I wanted, but I was broke. I had visited a convent friend in California, and she had lent me $20, $25 or something like that. So I wasn't completely broke, but I didn't have a whole lot to sustain myself. And I got to San Francisco and started wandering around and ended up at the Zen Center. And something about it, when I walked in, I felt something that made me feel that I wanted to pursue this, and I was curious. And but I didn't have any money except for this $25. And so I was talking to the woman in the office, and she said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to stay, but I don't have any money." She said, "Well, why don't you get a job?" And I said, "Well, yeah, maybe I should." And she said, "Well, what can you do?" And I said, "Well, I can teach and I can type." And she said, "Just a minute." And she went into the office and called her sister, who worked for a place called the Trust for Public Land. And they needed a typist for 2 months to retype their training manual. So I went in and I got the job. And then I went back and I said, "Well, now I need a place to stay." And she said, "Well, go look at the bulletin board." And I looked at the bulletin board, and I found a place about a block away from the Zen Center. And 2 days later, and it was full of, it was a flat with 10 people. Well, I was the 10th person. And at that time, it was kind of the hippie era. It was just after the hippie era. And so people were looking for this kind of balance. And I had the right sun sign, and I was a female. So they accepted me at this place. They were all Zen people. It was a block from Zen Center. And a few days later, Katagiri Roshi arrived from Minnesota, which is where I had started on this search for a teacher. And everyone said, "Oh, you must know Katagiri Roshi." And I said, "No, I don't." And they said, "Well, come and hear him speak at Green Gulch." Green Gulch Farm is one of the Zen Center, San Francisco Zen Center practice places. It's in Sausalito. So I went out there and I heard him, and somehow I was shuffled right up into the front row. But what struck me about him was that I didn't really understand a lot of what he said, but when he said something that sounded kind of stupid to me, he would just pause and continue. When he said something that sounded really brilliant to me, he would pause and continue. And I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to learn to continue no matter what happens. And so he left a few days later. And when I was finished with my job, a few months later, I went back to Minnesota and started studying with him. I really didn't want to study Zen because it's very hard for an extrovert to sit still. Plus, I was also doing a lot of dance at that point. And when you dance a lot, you can feel every muscle in your body. And so I was always shifting my position. And I had a reputation at the Zen Center as someone who couldn't sit still. But Katagiri Roshi never said anything about that. I was planning to only stay at Zen Center until I learned how to meditate. I just felt like this was the person I should learn how to meditate from. But after a few months, I realized that it wasn't enough time and that I needed to continue for a little bit longer to learn this. Also in Soto Zen, and my teacher really emphasized this, there's Dogen Zenji, who was the person who brought Soto Zen from China to Japan, really emphasized the importance of sitting with other people and not sitting alone too much. And my teacher's explanation of that was that when we sit alone too much, our practice becomes very self-centered. And my interpretation of that, of his saying that, is that this kind of self-centeredness is that we're just constantly understanding what is happening from our own perspective, and we don't learn from others. We don't expand ourselves beyond our own minds. And I feel that when we sit together, we may not be talking, but we are communicating. And I'm sure that every one of you has experienced what I mean. So this kind of communication, I think, is much, much more profound than the words we use, because the words we use are interpretations according to our own experience. Whereas the things we learn from others through silence are, I think, just the real deal. They're really pure communication. We can see it in body language, and we can experience it just by sitting quietly. In my tradition, we sit and face a wall. In other words, we sit and face ourselves. It's kind of like looking in a mirror at our minds. And it's very interesting because just like we can't see our eyes with our eyes, we really are so, kind of identified with our thinking. That's very difficult for us to see our own thinking from our own mind. But somehow, my experience has been that when I sit and face the wall, I notice things about my thinking. I don't have to try to notice it. In fact, when I first sat down, I was being very stubborn, and I thought, I'm just going to sit here and see what happens. I don't want anybody to tell me how to do this. I don't want anybody to tell me what I should be doing. I just want to sit here and see what happens. And if something happens that gives me a deeper understanding, then maybe I'll pursue it. Otherwise, I'm out of here and I'm going to go find something else. And interestingly enough, that is the practice of Soto Zen. It's called shikantaza. It means just sitting. And how I define shikantaza, my teacher defined it as just sit down and shut up. And he wouldn't give us too much information about how to do this. But the way I describe it as shikantaza is just sitting, is to resist the compulsion to do something. Because usually we want to do something. And, just like we can't stop thinking by our thinking, because that's just more thinking. We can't experience reality. We can't experience the interdependent reality in which we live by trying to do it with just purely with our minds. Dogen Zenji describes the experience of shikantaza, the experience of just sitting, as the walls and fences and grass and trees, everything starts to expound the Dharma. And then he goes on to say, but this is not something which is experienced with the conscious mind. Our conscious mind is just part of our being. And the awareness that we experience through Zazen practice is not something we can interpret through our minds, through our egos, through our personal experience and interpretation of life. It's something much more than that. And we can't experience it just by thinking about it. This is how Dogen Zenji teaches. He also describes this experience as yuge. It's two characters. One of these characters means to play freely, and the other character means to be transformed through play. So my teacher, Katagiri Roshi, defined yuge as transformation through free play. And that kind of free play is like just the pure experience, or the pure process, just like building a sandcastle on the beach. You just build it to experience building it. You know that it's going to get washed away, but that doesn't matter, because the process is what's important. And that process is what really, I think, helps us to deeply see what life is. I didn't understand what shikantaza was, but it fit very well with what I wanted to do, what I should say what I didn't want to do, which was to overlay some kind of process on the experience itself. And I just kept doing it. People complain about it, especially people who are just starting out, because they want something to do, something to hold on to. But Dogen Zenji really, in all of his teachings, he was kind of a rebel. And I think one of the reasons why I rejected his teachings for a long time, I didn't really reject him. I just thought he was crazy. For the first 6 or 7 years of my practice, I tried to read Dogen Zenji, because my teacher was kind of a Dogen Zenji fanatic, and that's practically all he talked about. And I tried to read Dogen, and I had no idea what he was talking about. And what I did think I understood just made me think that Dogen was just kind of some weird fanatic. So I put down Dogen, and, of course I went to all my teacher's lectures and everything. After about 7 years of the practice, I'd been ordained for about 2 years. I resisted ordination for a long time. My teacher kind of nudged me to do it, but I had a lot of fears around my experience in the convent, and my experience of being of feeling that I had to do something in a certain way. Just a second, I'm going to turn on the lights, kind of. And I really resisted that. And I think my experience in my 20s, even though I was a kind of a wild child, I was really a wild child. But one of the things that I learned from that was how to extract myself from the belief system that I had adhered to so strongly. And that was a really important thing for me to begin to recognize that there was a reality besides my definition of what it was. So I told you that I started with the idea of, if anybody tries to tell me anything about what to do, I'm out of here. I mean, I really felt that very strongly. And I didn't embrace the community that I was practicing with. They felt kind of almost cultish for me. to me. It seemed like they were revering this teacher rather than just appreciating what he had to offer. I think one of the takeaways that we all had after he died, my teacher died in 1962, no, in 1990, at the age of 62, which is quite young. But one of the takeaways that we had when several of us got together who had studied with him for a long time, was that we were inspired because not only was he very devoted to the practice in such a way that we could feel it, he embodied it, but he was also a very real person that made mistakes and was willing to admit that he made mistakes. He never tried to put himself into a high role that separated himself from his students. He always felt that teacher and students taught each other. And you've probably heard the image. I don't know where it comes from either, actually, but my teacher in Japan mentioned it to me when I was in the monastery. The teacher-student relation is like the chick in the egg, pecking from the inside and the teacher pecking from the outside. It's a mutual kind of experience. And a teacher, I hate the word teacher because it kind of has a certain meaning in this culture. And I feel like it means you got to be very kind of brilliant or very kind of beyond other people. And that's not the way it is. We're all practicing together. But my teacher, how I took on that role was one day I was sitting next to him. It was shortly after I was ordained. And we were at a dinner, and the person across from me said, "So what does it mean to be ordained?" Well, I might have said, what I felt about it, but my teacher was sitting right next to me. So I was like, no, I got to ask him. So I turned and I said, "What does it mean to be ordained?" And he said, "It means you become a teacher." And I was like, "What?" Because that wasn't really what I aspired to. I had always aspired kind of to this monastic life. And I recognized early on, when I'm quite young, that what I was really aspiring to was simplicity, was simplifying my life in such a way that I could really look deeply at what I was, what human life was, who I was, and just pursue that as best I could. And especially being an extrovert, I found that I was easily distracted. It was interesting to me when I was ordained, because when I made the decision to be ordained, and it took me a few years, maybe about 3 years before I actually could do it, could say, okay, I'm going to do this. But when I finally said this, okay, I can do this. I can go through this process because I know that this is something that I deeply want, that this will help me in some way. Immediately, my life came into focus, and I realized that this was the most important thing, and that prior to that, other than my time in the convent and everything prior to that, but in my 20s, I had been just so distracted by so many things, and I'd been, I can get interested in just about anything. I'm just kind of a very curious kind of person. But at that point, it was like, when I made that decision, everything came into focus, and I said, yes, this is very important. My spiritual practice is the most important thing in my life. And I don't think that it's necessary, particularly, to become a monastic in order to do that. My friend Tai, who used to be not a Trappist monk, but a Jesuit priest, he's not anymore, but he told a story one time. He told me about this guy who lived, who was a hermit out in the woods. And he lived in a small hut. And someone came out to him to ask him, what is the best way to do a spiritual practice? Well, he said the best way is to be totally engaged in life and to have a job and have a family and um, recognize that the spiritual practice is the most important thing. And he said, oh, so what is the second best way? And I don't remember what that was. It was like I don't remember what the second best way was. So he said, well, why is it that you're out here in the woods, being in a hut? And he said, well, we all do our best. And that's the way I sort of feel about it. I kind of need this this practice of having robes, putting on robes, and living in a temple. I need it to help me focus, because that's my life. But I think the most important thing is to recognize that that deep aspiration, that deep knowledge that we all have, that we are interdependent with all beings, and that everything is always changing, that there's no way, that Tao, or Do in Japanese, is not something definable. If you look at the history of Chan, actually I taught a class in Chan and Zen at a local college. I was asked to teach this class, and I thought, how am I going to teach this? And what I did was I decided to just go back to the origins of Chan and look at the teachings of the teachers that kind of have stood out, have popped out, and have created kind of little shifts in the practice. And the reason I did this was because I wanted the students to realize that it's not a fixed kind of understanding. It's not a fixed kind of practice. The forms are not the practice. The forms are important for keeping us all together in this practice, but they are not the practice itself. And the teachings, as they've been interpreted, we don't have to completely buy into them. We don't have to dismiss them if we don't understand them, but we don't have to say this is the way it is, which is a tendency that we as humans have. It's described by Buddha as dukkha, wanting to hold on to something. And this takes us away from the recognition that things are always changing. And it really is the source of deep suffering, even though we may not recognize it. It's a source of always chasing after something to hold on to, and never being satisfied with things as they are, because they may not be how we define them, or how we expect them, or how we understand them, or how we interpret them. And so Dogen Zenji, in his Kantaza practice, says, just sit and experience life as it is. It's not necessary to chase after something called enlightenment. And he said, the problem with having techniques for this recognition is that we can easily get caught in these techniques. And of course, with a good teacher, that's not necessarily the case, because that teacher can move us forward in the ways that we need to move forward. But he said even the monks that he was practicing with in his early days, before he went to China and discovered Shikantaza practice, he said he felt like they were practicing as a means to become enlightened. And what that does is it's the discriminating mind putting enlightenment outside of ourselves and chasing after something. And he said, Dogen Zenji says again and again in all of his writings that enlightenment or awakening is something that we experience every time that we sit down. And all we have to do is recognize that experience. And that experience is not some big lofty thing as we would imagine it to be. It's just what we recognize as our obstacles, what we recognize as our strengths. And it's these aren't things that are part of our conscious understanding. Our conscious understanding is always defining, this is good and this is bad, this is right and this is wrong, this is enlightenment and this is not, this is, I am this and I am not that, and comparing ourselves with others. And this kind of discrimination is exactly the kind of thing that creates problems. It's constant. This practice is a constant practice. It's not something that ever, that we ever can stop doing. It's constantly awakening to things as they really are. And to just sit down and shut up, no matter how we do it or why we do it, it helps us to recognize this. And Dogen Zenji talks about, and I don't think this is originally Dogen's idea, but this is where I learned it from. He says it's like walking in the mist. You can sit for a very long time before you see what's happening. Just as if you're walking in the mist, you don't necessarily feel that you're getting wet. But after you've walked for a really long time, you notice that you're soaked. This is the way this practice works, no matter how you do it, no matter where you do it. Just sitting down and shutting up. Whatever you do is just sitting down and shutting up. And so I have practiced with my teacher, and we started a monastery in southeastern Minnesota. Katagiri Roshi he was Japanese, but he taught first in San Francisco with Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. And then when Shunryu Suzuki Roshi died, he went to Minnesota at the invitation of a few people who were practicing there. And out of that, the Minnesota Zen Meditation Society started. And after that, he wanted to start a monastery. And we found some land in southeastern Minnesota, a large piece of land with nothing on it. I shouldn't say nothing, because there was lots of beautiful nature, and there was a creek. And our first meditation hall was a big army tent. And our first kitchen was a tent. And we all lived in tents. And we practiced down there. We couldn't practice there in the winter because Minnesota winters are too brutal for most of us city folks. And so we practiced when we could down there. And then he encouraged me to go to Tassajara after I was ordained. And Tassajara is a monastery way out in the mountains of near Carmel Valley in California, between Carmel Valley and Big Sur. And I spent a year and about 4 months there. And then I wanted to go to Japan. And Katagiri Roshi really didn't want me to go to Japan, but when I said I really wanted to go there, he sent me to a monastery called Hoshinji, which is in Obama, Japan. And it's just north of Kyoto on the Japan seaside. And there I found a very devoted monastic community, which was, in the Japanese tradition of Soto Zen, your training is, you only need 2 years of training. And I didn't go there to train, though. I went there to practice. I didn't know anything about certification or training or anything. I just went there to practice, and it happened to be a group of people who were very devoted to Zazen practice and living in a temple and taking care of the temple. I often say that what the training in a Zen temple is how to clean the temple, because that seems to be the emphasis. Aside from Zazen, that was the most important thing that we did, was to take care of the temple and clean the temple. And of course, serve people who came to visit the temple in whatever ways they needed, whether it was through memorial services or whatever they needed to help them in their spiritual practice. But when I was at Tassajara, one of the things that I kind of came up for me, this was in 1983, was how much my experience of Zen was very dominated by men. It was predominantly men. I noticed it when I first went to Minnesota Zen Center, and when I was at Tassajara, particularly in my second practice period, there was it was about 3 to 1 male to female. And of course, in Japan, I was in a monastery, so there were about 30 men and about 6 women. But when I was at Tassajara, one day I was sitting at lunch, and it just popped into my head, I should start a place where we can pursue women's insights, women's practice, because I felt like what was happening was that a lot of our insights were getting lost, either because they were being ignored or because, men just weren't understanding them. And sometimes I found that my insights were made fun of. And I thought, why am I allowing this to happen? Why do some of us women allow our insights to get lost because the men don't understand them? And so I decided I wanted to start a women's temple where we could just live together and do this practice together and see what came up for us. One of the things I experienced in going to all-girls Catholic schools was that when I had an insight and I stated it out loud, there was always someone who understood, and I could take it to the next level. And I felt like there was not a kind of balance in the Zen world, at least in the Zen world as I had experienced it. And so I wanted to create a place where we could strengthen our insights and bring it back so that there would be some kind of balance. But I didn't feel ready to do it. I talked about it for many years, and I didn't actually start creating this place, Great Tree Zen Women's Temple, until about the 2000. And that was at the nudging and pushing of my Dharma brothers and sisters who were saying, hey, you've been talking about this for a really long time. Would you please do it? And at that time, I had already kind of become the head or the leader of the Zen Center of Asheville, which was in Asheville, and it was basically a lay practice center that had developed simply because I arrived in Asheville and I was a monk, and people saw that as an opportunity to bring the practice together. And so even though it wasn't something that I really intended to do, I thought, well, if this helps people, I guess my job is to just be here and just to keep the practice alive. And so that's what I did for several years. And also I was working with the Charlotte Zen Meditation Society, which is what originally brought me out to North Carolina. But finally, after a while, I thought, my Dharma brothers and sisters are really right. I just need to do this. I just need to start it. And I just mentioned it. And the folks in Charlotte just jumped on it and created a board and moved it forward and fundraised. And before I knew it, after a few years, here it is. And Rudman and his wife, Maria, were out here, as he said, a few weeks ago, and they saw the results of it. It's quite a nice place, and we have a nice piece of property. And it's really ideal for this kind of startup. It also has a place where we can expand if we want to. And but at Zen Center of Asheville, most of my students were men, which I found kind of interesting, and I knew at that point that something about the way that I was pursuing the practice was more appealing to men than it was to women. So this has been kind of an interesting exploration for me, and continues to be very interesting to see why it is that I am not appealing to women as much as to men. What is it about this? And the way I kind of see it as when I used to study dance, there were some teachers who created choreography that I could immediately I understood and could do. And there were other teachers who created choreography that it took me a while to kind of understand and figure out. And that's the way that I have experienced Zen. It took a long time for me to really embrace it and understand the spirit of it, um, through the forms that have been created and through the schedules that have been developed. And I don't know whether these are the things that maybe it's the style. I don't know exactly what it is, but for me, Great Trees and Women's Temple is simply an exploration to see if there's another way to do it, and to just as I told you, I wanted to pursue the teaching Chan Buddhism from the historical perspective of how did the teachings change? What was it about these various teachers that changed? I started actually in Vietnam, where Thich Nhat Hanh has written a book where he says actually Chan Buddhism started in Vietnam. You won't find this in most history books because they say it started with Bodhidharma. But I started with this, I think his name was Tong Hui. I can't remember. There's a book about him that was written by Thich Nhat Hanh. And I started with his writings and then moved on to Bodhidharma and Huineng. And then I moved into Japan and we studied Dogen. And also there's some women teachers in Japan that we looked at. And then we moved to the United States, and what teachers in America have influenced Zen, including my own teacher. And that was the way we studied it, and looking at the different ways in which it was affected, not only by cultures, but by the teachers themselves who had insights. And we all have that capability to have insights, and we all, I believe, have to see this practice from our own experience and pursue this practice from our own experience with the guidance of a teacher. We study, that Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are the three important components of this practice. And Buddha starts out with a teacher as a guide, but the teacher as a guide just helps us to understand our own Buddha nature, or helps us to understand what is Buddha nature. Dogen Zenji says, Buddhism teaches that we all have Buddha nature, but he says that's not really the way it is. Everything is Buddha nature, and we are part of that. And to discover this Buddha nature, it helps to have someone to guide us to that from their own experience, from their own practice. And Dharma is just simply things as they are. It's also the teachings which point to things as they are. It's also everything in the phenomenal world, which is things as they are. And Sangha, which is in Japanese Zen, it's described as the way they wash potatoes. They put them into a bucket and put in a little water and roll the potatoes around, and the potatoes all wash each other. That's the way Sangha is. And Sangha is supportive, and it's also difficult, as I'm sure all of you have experienced. When you're together, it's like potatoes being bumping up against each other and knocking off the dirt, knocking off the unnecessary. And so Buddha nature is something that we are all part of, and it's something that we can all discover through the guidance of a teacher, and recognize where our obstacles are, and recognize where our strengths are, and contribute them. And I'm going to finish by telling you, Katagiri Roshi said that the main purpose of our practice is to learn how to live in peace and harmony with all beings. So that's all. I don't know what else you do when I don't see you, so maybe you can tell me where to go from here. Are we done? Does anyone have anything to add or subtract or question?
Teijo, we will close with the boundless compassion again, and then maybe we have a few for question and answer, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
Boundless compassion. As holy persons awake and serve This Buddha, source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. The pure heart always rejoices. In the light we call this, in the dark we call this. Moment after moment, the true heart arises. Time after time, there is nothing but this. Absorbing yourself awakens the Buddha light. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. Thus the pure heart always rejoices. In the light we call it, in the dark we call it. Moment after moment, the true heart arises. Time after time, there is nothing but this. Absorbing yourself awakens the Buddha light. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. Thus the pure heart always rejoices. In the light we call it, in the dark we call it. Moment after moment, the true heart arises. Time after time, there is nothing but this.
Thank you so much, Teijo. May I ask Helen to allow our faces to be seen, please?
Yes.
And first, I apologize, Teijo. You had not been able to see our faces while you were giving a talk because you, the transmission or the, yes, the bandwidth is not sufficient to have everybody, and so we're trying to minimize the incident of freezing. So sometimes a speaker can freeze, but somehow that is our way of minimizing that. So thank you for your forbearance in speaking to a blank screen with different names. But you hit home with several very important points there. Helen, would you please start my video?
I've been starting your video.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Especially in your description of spiritual practice as being fully engaged in life. And then also you're starting a women's temple really is something that is an important contribution to Zen in this part of the world. There are, of course, several other women or many other women teachers, but your way of focusing on that is really something that is a big contribution. But enough of me. I'm sure that you raised some points that others have resonated with and would like to ask you about or mention something about. And I'd like to ask Helen to facilitate the question and answer or sharing. Please, Helen, please take it from there.
You can raise your hand and I'll just spotlight you or pin video you and you can speak after that. Anybody, please?
Just say something.
Yes, Maria has her hand raised. Go ahead.
So Teijo, thank you so much for your talk. I'm so happy to see you again after we first met in Asheville. And I think it's really perhaps not a coincidence, but I started collecting books on Chinese nuns and teachers before I even went to Asheville, because I also had the feeling that we are studying this tradition, and most of the teachers that we ever find in our koan books are not women, and that this dimension is missing. And I think my question is, maybe, was there the experience in your upbringing in a Catholic school and then also as a nun being among women, that you felt that there is something distinctive that women can bring to the practice also in this organized form of having a women's temple, or where do you think it came from?
Connection here and I got cut off.
Oh, you're fine.
It says I'm unmuted.
Yes,
Oh,
we
okay,
can hear
thank
you. We can see you.
So could you repeat your question? I didn't hear the first part.
So the inspiration to, I explained that I've also recently been starting to read about more women teachers and trying to find out about the tradition, because in our koan study, we don't have women teachers as such. And so my question was more specifically, did you notice in your interaction with your teachers perhaps that there was a difficulty in understanding you as a woman, or it shouldn't be either or, but your early formation of being in a Catholic girls' school and also then being in a monastery, did you feel that maybe there is a different approach to practice among women than there is among the men?
I think there is, but I don't know what it is. That's why I said it's kind of an exploration for me, because actually the Catholic Church is I was told this very young when I was in high school, that it was a patriarchy and we just had to accept that, you know? And so I feel like women have always practiced separately from men in the Catholic Church, or at least in my lifetime, in my experience. And you know, it wasn't until, and I accepted my teacher, and I felt like we had a very we both had a deep spiritual aspiration that we recognized in each other, and that he helped me really cultivate it, and I really appreciate that. But there's something about that that is not, I feel like I got past some of those obstacles, maybe because I was raised in a patriarchal situation and accepted a lot of that patriarchy, but also I had the experience of practicing with women, and so I know that there's something different, but I don't know exactly what that is. I went back to the convent where I was about 2 or 3 years ago, just to see what was going on. What was it? Was there anything there that I could draw from it, or what was it that was there that I was drawing from? And it was a very interesting experience. I hadn't been back in about 50 years, so you can imagine what that was like. But I felt so connected to these women, and I felt so much love for these women. And I really don't know what it was. I feel like I still want to go back and check that out again and see if I can get anything from it. I don't have the same belief system. I'm completely, I have completely, those times in my 20s were so transformative, that I recognize some of the difficulties of the kind of belief system that I had adhered to. And really kind of, and then my first several years of meditation, I really kind of, and maybe I'm still doing this, I kind of processed through these belief systems and realized kind of maybe where they might have come from, but then what they became and how they've been interpreted and things like that. So, I don't have the same belief system, but at the same time, there's some kind of deep connection that I felt with these women, and they still embraced me, and I felt their love, and there's something there that I feel is not present in the Zen world as I've experienced it. And when I brought this up at the Zen Center of Asheville and said, I've got to pursue this. And I'd been there for about 8 years at that point. I said, I've got to pursue this thing. This is something I've really wanted to do. And we had to go through mediation for a year because the guys just didn't understand it, And what I found myself saying was, well, I just feel I'm not doing this because I want to separate women from men or because I want to make a distinction, but because I want to find that balance. I feel like there's not a balance in the Zen world, that women's insights are not being, that we are not bringing them forth as we should to bring about that balance. I experienced something when I was at a meeting with some of the other ordained people from my teacher. We were at a meeting and I said something that came from a very deep place. And one of the guys, one of the priests, the men priests said, made fun of it. And I didn't react by saying, wait a minute, that came from a very deep place. Would you listen? I have something to say here. I reacted by kind of attacking him back. And it turned into a kind of a conflict. And then somebody said, what's going on here? And I said, I got to think about this. And I didn't say anything, and they changed the subject and talked about something else. And I realized what had happened was that I was not acknowledging this really invaluable insight that I had, that I was allowing it to be dismissed. And I feel like that some of us do that. And I'm sure that's not true of all women. A lot of women don't accept that when I say that and say, well, I don't do that, But I'm not talking to those women. I'm talking to the women that actually do that, because I don't see many women in the Zen world that are standing up and saying, we need this balance and here are our insights. Does that make sense? Am I addressing your question?
Yes, completely. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Jean, and this will perhaps be the last one. Jean, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, thank you so much. That was such an authentic from the heart presentation, and you're just so grounded, you can feel it. And I think my question is more of a comment. I've recently been reading about people of color also desiring this formation or a group to sit together, and I was struggling trying to understand, and what you have described about the need for women's insights, I think can be applied. I'm not a person of color, and so perhaps this isn't my place, but I found that very enlightening to think about that, a place to bring up insights that perhaps people don't feel free to share in a bigger group. And I just find that very valuable to think about. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Maybe we have time for one last question. If you would like to raise your hand and let me know, or comment. Okay, Emily.
Well, I'm sorry. Teijo, this is difficult for me to speak because it comes from I just related so much to what you were saying. You considered yourself an extrovert. When I reflect back, I considered that I had ADD. I just could not, I could not focus. And I still feel that is a real challenge for me in my practice, and that my mind, my teacher has done a wonderful job of getting me to focus on my breath and to keep going back to that. But, my mind can go into, it's almost like all at once there are characters playing out scenarios, and I go, where did this come from? And then I go back to my breath. I'm just not sure what happens to my mind when I sit and face the wall. But it is, I feel like, and I know there's no shoulds or should nots, and you helped me kind of accept myself much more than I have been doing. But it's a real challenge. Thank you. If you want to comment, I would appreciate that.
You know, I just want to, yeah, I want to comment on that. I don't know. It says my internet connection is unstable, so maybe I'll get lost. But as I told you, you know, my fellow students at Minnesota Zen Center were always, they were always teasing me because I couldn't sit still. And we went through we went through a jukai, which is receiving the precepts, and that's when you first get your name. My name Teijo, and my teacher translated my name as right stillness. That was, he gave me 2 different translations. And when I first got that name, I thought it was a joke because, you know, obviously I was the one that couldn't sit still. And but when after our Jukai ceremony, I saw him at, you know, the brunch or whatever it was, and he looked at me and he said, "Do you like your name?" And it was clear to me that he saw something that I wasn't recognizing. He saw something in me. And I you know, I feel like that's kind of my own koan or something. And so for years, I didn't even talk to him about that, but I just kind of looked at it. And at one point I did talk to him about the meaning of my name. But what I finally discovered was that, you know, the center of the cyclone is very still, and that we all have quiet within us, and that all of that noise and busyness that we see, it's just something that's an overlay on that stillness. In fact, I see it as kind of the opposite of what I learned in Catholicism. You know, in Catholicism, they say, in Christianity, they say that you come into life tainted and that you have to, you know, be purified. But I feel like it's the opposite. We come into life pure, and we just have to continue to recognize that. And that for me, that is very much the part of my spiritual practice, very much a part of my spiritual practice, is just returning to that silence, just remembering that silence, remembering the depth of what we all have. And that silence is what helps us to recognize that we're part of a bigger reality, and that everything is always changing, and that even those moments when our mind is too busy, if we judge those moments when our mind is busy, oh, I'm doing it wrong, oh, this isn't the way it should be, all we're doing is adding to the busyness. So I think to just notice it and move on. And as you say, return to the breath. That is, to me, the most fundamental thing that we can do is just return to our breath. And that will help us in every aspect of our life, not just in our meditation practice. If we notice that we're getting distracted or off balance, we just return to the breath. So thank you for saying that. Thank you for reminding us all of that.
Let us now close with the verse of purification and the chant of Shalom. I would like to personally thank Teijo, I can't even find you, there you are, for the wonderful talk this morning. And just to remind you, Teijo, I did visit your Zen Center around 10 or 12 years ago, and unfortunately you weren't there, so your assistant was there, and she gave me this very nice mug. And if you can recall, when you came to Texas for the AZTA meeting in Austin, we sat together in the bus, and you still had a lot of hair there. So thank you again, and it's good to see you.